I welcome you all in this session. Earlier to it, we have been discussing the theories of emotion. We have already discussed James Lange theory and Cannon-Bard theory. Now we will proceed further with the rest of the theories. As we acknowledge by now that emotions play a very significant role in personality development of an individual, and it is the duty of the teacher and parents to help the children so that they can come to know how emotional development can be done in a proper manner. From where these emotions occur, researchers have been trying to know from where and how these emotions occur. That is why today in this session we are trying to discuss the theories of emotion, how the psychologists are trying to prove. Now we start with the theory, that is Scatter-Singer theory of emotion. It is also known as two-factor theory. It is also known as cognitive labeling theory of emotions. We also call it arousal cognition theory. It means this theory given by Scatter and Singer is known by many names, and the two-factor theory name is more popular, whereas we call it cognitive labeling theory also. This theory points out that emotions are generally physiological similar. Emotions tend to vary along a weak, strong dimensions that is determined by level of arousal. How the emotions are determined? So, the dimension and intensity of the emotion, it depends on the determination level of arousal. We make cognitive appraisal of situation, then attribute the label. Recognition of external events is also involved here. Some events take place, we come across some influential personality, and we try to judge, we try to evaluate, and after that appraisal, after that evaluation, we try to put label what kind of a person he was I met, or what kind of, how the event or circumstances happened another way which I was expecting in different manner. So this kind of appraisal is understood by an individual, is judged by an individual, then one tries to attribute the label, and recognition of these external events is also involved here. One tries to understand the external factors of that events. Emotions producing situations are labeled as per our cognition or knowledge. How do we put label on a person, personality of an individual, or occurring of the event or circumstances or the situation? How do we label? As per our knowledge, as per our evaluation, as per our cognition, we try to put label. It depends how we perceive the circumstances of arousal and label, and we label them as joy, as anger, as despair, because how we perceive the situation, we try to put the label. If someone is behaving or giving opinion according to our wishes, we will feel joy, otherwise we will feel angry. So on these basis, on these judgment or evaluation or appraisal, we try to put label. That's why this theory has been named by this cognition or labeling theory. Let us discuss further. When the physiological arousal occurs, the individual must identify the reason for this arousal to experience and label it as an action. हम कहीं गए, कोई घटना घटी, किसी ने हमें कुछ कहा, so we try to know how this was aroused, how the event occurred, how the person got angry, or why the person was not happy to me, or why the person greeted me with a joy. We try to identify the reason how this arousal occurred and we label it as an emotion. A stimulus leads to physiological response that is then cognitively interpreted and labeled, resulting in an emotion. So, it results in an emotion. Further, for example, you are going for an interview. Very simple example I have taken. You are going for an interview and you experience a racing heart and sweating palm. डर लग रहा है क्या होगा? You may label the emotion as anxiety, but if you experience the same when you are waiting for your family member at airport, you may label it as joy. At airport, when you are waiting for your family member, you might be experiencing the same racing heart, but that is not anxiety, that is joy. So, another experiment was conducted where male college students were injected with epinephrine, an adrenal hormone which induces an aroused state. Some subjects were informed that the usual effects of this injection include trembling hands, pounding heart and a flushed face, and the other subjects were told nothing about these reactions, believing the injection to contain vitamin compound, the effects of which would be tested at a later stage. Still, a third group was led to expect symptoms which would not appear, such as numb feeling and itching. So then these three groups were exposed to externally stimulating circumstances with the hypothesis that those who did not expect the internal changes and those expecting different physiological changes would be most influenced by the external circumstances. So this kind of experiment was done by Scatter and Singer because they were having different opinion from James Lang and Canon Bard. So they were trying to prove that once when the events occur or when we meet some person, we try to judge, we try to evaluate how that emotions, how that event arousal was took place. So how it took place, one tries to put the label. Then the circumstances used to test these predictions involved a euphoric condition where an assistant of the experimenter who pretended to be a subject acted in extremely jovial ways, and an anger situation where the assistant showed extreme irritation and he and the true subject completed an insulating personal questionnaire. All subjects in both circumstances were observed through a one-way mirror, and after the experiment they were questioned about their feelings during the incident. Every group was asked, how did you feel when the incident was taking place? So all were supposed to answer, how did you feel? Then both the observations and self-reports indicate that the subjects without expectations about the physiological reaction to the injection were more susceptible and others were not. I would like to give you one more example where arousal cognition theory has been supported, where the state of arousal was occurred as a natural phenomena instead of using drugs. Two groups were before the electric shock. इलेक्ट्रिक शॉक के सामने दो ग्रुप्स बैठा दिए गए and one was made aware about tremors and heart palpitation resulting from pill. One group was informed कि ऐसा होगा. Both the groups showed the described symptoms, but the group which was informed about pill tolerated more and reported that the shock was less painful. One group was told and the other group was not told. Then both the groups showed the described symptoms. Symptoms दोनों ने दिखाए, but the group which was informed that this palpitation and trembling will be due to pill, they tolerated more and reported that the shock was less painful. So the results indicated that the emotional state was determined by both physiological arousal and the individual's interpretation of the situation. You know, how you interpret that situation. In the beginning, I quoted Paul Ekman that these emotions, they are important. How the emotion change, that how we see the world and how we interpret the action and behavior of the individual. So it is based on two things, our physiological arousal and the individual's interpretation of the situation, how one individual interpret. For example, दो बच्चों को एक ही बात पर टीचर ने डांटा कि आप पढ़ते नहीं हैं. So it might be possible that one child says, oh, teacher is really well wisher of mine, he or she is bothered about my result. But the second child may get irritated why the teacher is asking time and again and why bothering me to study time and again. So this depends on the interpretation of the situation, how one individual takes it, perceives it, and how one interpret it. We have talked in our previous lectures about perception. So perception is also very important, and we have talked about attitude also, because how we perceive the things, it makes our attitude, and on the basis of perception and attitude one tries to interpret the situation. Then to sum up this theory, emotions are part of our life. Sometimes naturally, sometimes we are angry, some we are in distress, sometimes we are in anxiety, sometimes we are happy. So every individual is having these emotion in a combined manner. Only when we talked about emotional development, only thing which matter is that one has to learn in the life that where to control the emotion and where to express the emotions. So now further proceeding with this theory, we were talking that emotions are part of our life. So according to this theory, emotions provoking events produce increased arousal. In response to the feelings of arousal, we search the cause in external environment. Try to understand, when response is aroused, feeling is they aroused, then what do? We search the cause in external environment. Why it happened? Why that fellow rebuked me? Why he did not greet me? Why these things happened in this manner which I was expecting the another way? So one tries to find the cause in external environment कि ऐसा क्यों हुआ? What happened? What was the reason behind this happening? What was the reason behind this incident? So further, this theory is named as two-factor theory. Why? Because it considers both arousal and cognitive appraisal that we perform in our efforts to identify the cause of such arousal. That's why this is known as two-factor theory. You know, the same thing when this theory has its merits. On some of the points, this two-factor theory has been criticized. Let us see what are those factors. It has been criticized by others. Sometimes that emotions are experienced before we think about them, and critics were also of the viewpoint that there are actual physiological differences between emotions. On this basis, it has been criticized. Now, let us conclude with these three theories: James Lange theory and the Cannon-Bard theory and Scatter-Singer theory. This picture is enough to make us revise. First, we see the dog, then heart propounding, then fear, then Cannon and Bard say when we see a dog, then the arousal of the physical responses and the emotion of fear they occur simultaneously. And the Scatter-Singer two-factor theory say when we see the dog, arousal of heart propounding and the cognition. After the cognition, one feels that the dog may not bite me, then the emotion of the fear is aroused. So this was all about this James Lange theory, Cannon-Bard theory and Scatter-Singer two-factor theory. Let us proceed further with the other theories. Then the appraisal theory of emotion. It was given by Magda B. Arnold and Richard Lazarus. Both of these psychologists, they joined their efforts and gave this appraisal theory of emotion. Let us see what Arnold and Lazarus wanted to say. According to appraisal theory of emotion, when we interpret a situation, it creates an emotional response. Definitely, when we try to interpret situation, it is natural that some of the emotional response will be created. We may be happy, we may be angry, we may be in a sorrowful mood. So this theory emphasizes that when events occur, we evaluate, we interpret and we explain, and emotions are created out of that appraisal. When we evaluate the situation on the basis of that, we get happy or we get sad. So it brings different reactions in different people. On the same situation, one may be happy, one may not be happy. Magda B. Arnold and Richard Lazarus both contributed in it. American psychologist Magda made early attempts in 1960s. She opined that when we experience the emotion only after the appraisal of a situation, first we make appraisal of the situation, then we experience the emotion. Then, according to Magda, physiological changes are important but do not take place before emotions. See, whereas in James Lang theory, they wanted to prove that physiological changes occur first, then the emotion take place. But the psychologist Magda opined that physiological changes are important. She acknowledges, but was of the viewpoint that it do not take place before emotion. They are important, but they do not take before the emotions. How? Then further, Lazarus theory states that a thought must come before any emotion or physiological arousal. In other words, you must first think about your situation before you can experience an emotion. Lazarus also wanted to prove that before you experience an emotion, you try to acknowledge, you try to make effort why this thought comes from where. So, Lazarus in 1991 developed his cognitive mediation theory after adapting Arnold's work. He took Arnold's work and on the basis of that theory developed his more ideas. He emphasized that our emotions are determined by our appraisal of the stimulus, but it suggests that immediate unconscious appraisal mediate between the stimulus and the emotional responses. We will discuss what is this mediation. Lazarus asserted that primary appraisal established the significance and meaning of an event, and secondary appraisal judges the ability of a person to cope with the consequences of an event. Try to understand. Lazarus discussed about two types of appraisal, primary appraisals and secondary appraisal. He opined that through primary appraisal, one established the significance of an event, significance of emotion. One comes to know about the stimuli, about the event, maybe threat or dangers in the situation, in the circumstances. Then through secondary appraisal, what one does, one judges the ability of himself or herself whether I can cope with the consequences of an event. यानी पहले देखा कि वातावरण में क्या क्या खतरे हैं, क्या क्या थ्रेट हैं. दूसरे सेकेंडरी अप्रेजल के द्वारा ये देखा, ये जज किया इंडिविजुअल ने कि क्या मेरे अंदर इतनी सामर्थ्य है कि मैं इस इवेंट के जो खतरे हैं उनके साथ अपना जो है कोप अप कर सकूं या मैं उसको सह सकूं या उसका सामना कर सकूं. लेट अस सी. You must be aware that appraisal is the act of developing an opinion, judgment or assessment of the value of something. Actually, through this theory, it has been tried to make it clear why different people have different perception of emotional reaction to the same situation. Earlier, when we started discussion in the introduction itself, I spoke to you listeners, dear friends, that it is most of the time that situation is the same and different people are perceiving the situation in a different manner. So, how it happens, how one makes the appraisal. So, again I'll remind you about our perception, because this is our perception, how we take the things, how we feel the things. So, here again I'll remind our respected teachers and parents that it is their duty to help the children so that they can perceive the things in a balanced emotional manner, so that their perception is correct, their correct attitudes are formed, because it will help them to understand the whole life, to understand the whole education. It will be helpful for them to make or to have an understanding of the aims of education. Further, Lejarus further asserted that the mediation between stimulus and emotional response is immediate and often unconscious. Sometimes this mediation is unconscious, one is not aware, but this mediation is taking place. Whereas, on the opposite hand, Scatter opined that after the interaction between physiological arousal and cognition, the emotion takes place. So, there is a slight difference of opinion between the psychologists. All the researchers, all the psychologists viewed the things from their own perspective. We cannot say who was wrong and who was right, because all were trying to put forward the reality, the facts from their own perspective, from their own point of view. So, Lejarus simply wanted to say that only after the appraisal we put cognitive label, simultaneously stimulating both the physical arousal and the emotional experiences, because Lejarus wanted to emphasize on this point that before one put the label, one make the label on the emotion, it is important, and it happens that one makes the appraisal. Then he also asserted that when we interpret the emotions therein, that cognitive ability could be conscious or unconscious. Hence, it is not certain that activity takes the form of conceptual processing. It is not certain. So, what is the intensity of emotion is controlled by cognitive processes, because when I am speaking to you about the emotional development or the balanced emotional expression, we have to see that it is the intensity of emotion. It has to be controlled, and it is controlled by cognitive processes. Then, with the help of coping ability and strategies, the relationship between person and the environment is mediated, which further form the basis of emotional reaction. To be more clear, it is asserted that through primary appraisal, it can be judged what will be the degree of harm a stressor can bring to an individual. On the other side, through secondary appraisal, it is judged what are the options available to manage and cope with the stressor and how effective they can be proved. One will try to acknowledge what are the options available. Through them I can manage the situation, manage the stress and cope with the situation, and how effective my strategies, my techniques will be, one tries to judge it first. Then it can be concluded that James Lang theory says that stimulus leads to the arousal that leads to the emotion. The sound of a gunshot, for example, leads to the physiological responses like rapid heart rate and trembling that lead to the subjective expression of fear. Then after James Lang, if I take the same example in the Cannon-Bard theory, according to Cannon-Bard theory, to sum up, the stimulus leads to both the arousal and the emotion. The sound of a gunshot, for example, leads both to the physiological responses like rapid heart rate and trembling, and to the subjective expression of fear. Because Cannon and Bard both wanted to prove that the physical changes and the experience of emotion, they take place side by side. One doesn't cause the other, and according to two-factor theory, stimulus leads to arousal that is labeled by applying cognition that leads to emotion. Same example of gunshot creates physiological responses like rapid heart rate and trembling that are interpreted as fear by subjective experience. And theory by Lejaras says the stimulus leads to a personal meaning gained by cognition, resulting into both arousal and the emotion. When a sound of gunshot is heard, it will be interpreted as something dangerous and leads to both physiological responses like a rapid heart rate and trembling and the subjective experience of fear. So, I hope all these theories are clear to us. We have seen that the scatter-singer theory is a little bit different from the other theories, and in the same way Lejaras and Arnold, when they joined hands, they wanted to prove how one tries to judge what are the threats in the environment and what are the options available and how I can cope with this. So, I hope all these theories are clear to listeners and viewers, and they will help them to understand and to have a background to understand the development of the emotions and their significant role which emotions play in day-to-day life. So, I hope it will be helpful for everyone. Thank you.